Okay, I think we are good now.
All right.
Okay, so just making sure, guys, everything is good. Let me get my live chat up here real quick. It's always a little bit of a lag.
Sure.
Awesome. Okay, very good. Now we're not proportioned right. You're like, I'm like really close to the camera. Maybe I should scoot back a little bit so we're more proportioned.
Oh, you're fine.
Okay, so as you can see, I have a guest on. Finally, we got her on. Yay. And we're both kind of winging it today. We've been talking back and forth for a while about this concept. And how many of you know Joyce, and I like to pick her brain a lot because she comes from a different background than a lot of us. So, but I'm just going to start out by doing my intro. I'm finding out that the older I get, how important and vital relationships, environment, and upbringing plays into future relationships as adults. Oftentimes, I see connections between the way that we were raised and how relationships with our spouses, friends, and kids work. So, today we're going to talk about unnecessary burdens that we often place on our own shoulders in the area of marriage. This is kind of, coming over from January. I'd wanted to have her uh, a while ago, but it just now worked out that she was able to come on. Both Joyce and I have had religious upbringings our entire lives. Joyce was a little more hardcore than I in her upbringing, but my parents did dabble in some of the far extreme rights. I would consider like Gothard, different. My mom kind of went back and forth on the whole head covering thing. We never really went that route, but she thought about it for a little bit in some of the far right religious wings. So thankfully, they saw many of the errors, but I do think that this did influence them to an extent. So we're going to talk about unnecessary burdens that often come with this type of upbringing. So obviously, many of you know Joyce. Joyce, go ahead and introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, hi. I was raised Old Order Mennonite, which is to the outside world looks very similar to Amish, although they would be quite happy to tell you they are not the same. We didn't have cars or electricity or phones, and it was um, it was not a healthy way to grow up. But like you look at the lifestyle, I think a lot of people are drawn to that. It's very quaint, and if you could separate the lifestyle from the religion, those facts look good, and I still like a lot of those things like homemaking. I want to have a garden. My husband and I dream of having a tiny little farmstead someday. Things like that. With those groups, the Amish and the Mennonites, you cannot separate the culture. You cannot separate the lifestyle from the religion. Um, and so it's a very toxic and highly controlled environment where you are told what to think, what to feel, what to believe. And yeah, it leads to um, a lot of adults who aren't thinking for themselves and aren't um, trying to think of the words. Basically, you end up everybody's just trying to keep the community together at the cost of the individuals. And that is never a good thing.
Right. Yes. So tell me a little bit about, and I'm going to say this is going to be very broad. We're painting with a broad brush today. We're not going to, with the exception of the community that she grew up in, we're not going to like name any specific groups or anything. This can be, I think, in any group, whether that's IFB, whether that's Catholicism, whether that's, I don't know, any religious sect, I guess. This can be in it, it can be prevalent. In fact, I've heard some IFB preachers growing up say some horrible things about women, towards women, victim shaming, victim blaming. I've heard quite a bit of that growing up. I think this generation is becoming a little bit more careful with that because of awareness and understanding how those things impact actual
Right.
victims that horrible crimes happen to. So I do think they're becoming a little bit more aware, but I think it is because the internet
Mm-hmm.
actually and how things go viral, and they've had to pay the consequences for hurtful words and things that they've said against victims. And I am against victim shaming. I'm against victim blaming. My husband and I have made it very clear that we are against any type of abuse in marriage at all, physical, any type of abuse that goes on, and that a woman should seek help if that's happening. But
Right.
what was the overall, or what were the overall feelings towards women in your community growing up? If you could just give some examples.
Right. Um, for sure, women were seen as lesser than men. I would say lesser value, and nobody would ever have said that. When I present ideas in today's conversation, they would never have said that, and they would still vehemently deny that if you ask them about it. These are just um, unspoken ideas that were very apparent to me growing up. Women were seen as lesser in value for sure, and I also feel like men were very threatened by women. So women were kind of seen as dangerous and unpredictable, right? Um, and so, women needed to be controlled and subdued. There was, and I feel like that went both ways. The fear, um, and maybe this is just me, but I feel like when there's like the liberal world where gender isn't supposed to be a thing, right? And then there's the hyperfixation on almost obliterating gender and what that means. And then in the opposite extreme, there's also a hyperfixation on gender and gender roles where it was like making sure everybody fits into this precise little box without understanding that whether you're male or female, you're an individual.
Mm-hmm.
And some traits tend to be more common among females and tend to be less common among males, but that doesn't necessarily always make them feminine. And there are things that are just human. And I think it's extremely unhealthy and a little weird whichever way you go with that super fixation on gender. It's like we're people. Gender's a fact. Let's move on.
Right. And then, too, I mean, there is the verse that talks about we're all one in Christ, right? So gender doesn't matter when it comes to who, Jew, Gentile, black, white, female, male. We're
Exactly.
all one in Christ. Obviously, anyone can come to Christ and accept that free gift of salvation. But what was there biblical basis given for the way that they viewed women, and what biblical basis was that? If that, I don't know how
Yeah.
the Amish is. I know you have church services and things. um is it like IFB where you base everything you do off the Bible, and the Bible is touted, or Bible verses are given? I mean, how is
Mm-hmm.
that? And
So there's definitely a lot of Bible verses, like they have their certain ones that they like to point to that applies. For instance, like the verses on submission, right? Well, every situation where there's a woman involved, that verse is going to apply. Like they'll turn to their verses, and it doesn't matter what the situation is. Somehow that verse is going to fit, or they're going to make it fit. But then there's also a lot of just the way it has always been done. They're
tradition.
very stuck on their traditions. Um, and when you said church services, that kind of made me laugh because they literally seat men and women separate. You cannot sit with your family.
Mm.
The men sit on half of the building, and the women sit in the other half. And then they also divide people up by whether you're married or not and what age you are.
Oh,
So, yeah.
they have a little bit of segregation going on there.
Oh, yeah. And it has to be that way because if it's not, then, well, new things are always a threat. You could never consider changing anything. It has always been that way.
So you probably love the family segregate or the family integration, not segregation, the
Oh,
family
yeah.
integration in your church.
Oh, yeah. I can't imagine it being any different now.
Yeah. Now, I barely ever get to sit with my husband because he's the pastor. So I'm always
Really.
corralling the kids. And I love it when we go to special meetings and I'm able to actually sit by him. That's like a really good feeling.
Yeah.
Now, how were the men perceived in the community?
Yeah, that's a good question. I also think that women saw men as dangerous and unpredictable. Um, there was this idea, I think, that men were kind of like these animals,
Mm-hmm.
and like men weren't really seen as being capable of um, being understanding and respectful and loving very much. It was more like they were just these, and what ended up happening when you have a man and a woman who don't trust each other, and the woman is being told she has to submit to the man no matter what. So she can't bring things to her husband. She can't have open conversations with him, and she doesn't trust him. Even if she were to do that, she doesn't trust him to hear her. What ends up happening is you have extremely manipulative women
Mm.
who end up, using whatever means they can to manipulate their husband into making the choices they want, into kind of the decisions and things, because women weren't really supposed to be involved in decision making. I'm sure they would have said they were, and that's something I struggle with to this day, is that a lot of the words that they said are the same words that I would say, right? Like in a marriage, a husband and wife, it's a good thing if they discuss things together, but obviously the husband gets a final say. But that's not the way that it played out in that culture. I read many articles, like they have all these like women's magazines and things that people can write into, and then they publish them. And I remember so many stories of where it's just like this woman whose husband is making a decision that she doesn't agree with, and the answer is for her to just shut up. And I'm not saying that there isn't a place for a woman to just keep silent and let her husband take the lead, obviously, but it was very much a message of that is the way life is. Your husband gets to do whatever he wants, and it does not matter what you're experiencing. It doesn't matter. um, and I think that can be hard for people who came from the world and they see women kind of, being Karens and all that. And it's like, well, if your husband makes a decision you don't like, you should still submit. Yes, I agree with you. And in a perfect marriage, that would happen. A perfect wife would submit. Also, a perfect husband would at least hear her out and care about how a decision affects her.
Mm-hmm.
And that was never something that I heard talked about, that a husband's actually supposed to care about his wife in that way. There was very much an imbalance in information going toward men on how to be a husband compared to towards women on how to be a wife. The whole focus was on how to be a wife, how to shut up, be a doormat, don't say anything, don't think, don't feel. And about toward men, it was not like that. There was very much just like, well, you're the leader.
Mm-hmm.
And I've recently, there have been a couple of sermons that I heard, and my husband talks about this to me sometimes too, about the idea that, and I'm blanking on the verse, about so that your prayers aren't hindered.
Mm-hmm.
And just the idea of how much a husband is supposed to love his wife, enough to die for her. And that isn't said toward women, that women are expected to die for their husband, which is interesting. Um, but I'm very blessed to be married to a man who cares about what I think. And in fact, that's part of why he married me, because I have thoughts and opinions, and he liked that.
Yep. Yeah, and that's what I was wondering too. I wanted to ask if the husband's role was ever touched on, right? Lots of men like to beat their chest about women submit, but yet
Mm-hmm.
the Bible tells men to love, you ought to love your wife, more than your own
Mm-hmm.
body, and love your wife as Christ loved the church. I mean, Christ loved the
Yes.
church so much that he gave everything for the church. I mean, he
Mm-hmm.
died, he gave his life for the church. So that is often glossed over,
Very
and then it's
much.
far right, religious sects
Mm-hmm.
that's not really
And
touched
what you
upon.
said, yes, and what you said about beating their chests makes me think of the Chad meme, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that was the stereotype, that men were expected to be a Chad.
Yeah.
And I always found that very interesting, because as my husband was just telling me this recently, like, as a leader, um, shouldn't men be trying to be like Christ was when he was on earth?
Mm-hmm.
He literally washed feet.
Yeah.
He wasn't a Chad.
Yeah.
He served people. A real leader, a biblical leader, is a servant to the one he's leading. And I just, the day and night compared to what I grew up not even realizing I was taking this message in, but of what a leader's supposed to look like. And when I think about that, like, I'm almost getting emotional, because it's so different. It's so different.
Yeah, my husband always says that a true leader doesn't lead by putting a gun to his wife's head and forcing her ahead of him, right? A true leader,
Exactly.
a true leader is going to have his wife want to follow him. And that's what a true
Yes.
leader is, when you have a wife that loves you and desires to
Mhm.
follow your lead, and she trusts you, and she's following your example, and she believes in you. That's what a real leader is like. So what was your, and then how were children treated as you were growing up, and what was your view of marriage? And this is what I was going to ask. Does anyone, do you ever see married couples that have a friendship, that are close? Do you see couples marry for love? I mean, or is it just they're not really arranged, are they?
No, they're not arranged. That's for
Okay.
sure. You do choose who, um, a boy asks, and a girl gets to choose if she says yes or no. Now, I have heard many stories of girls if who felt like they got the message that if he asks, it means it's the Lord's will, and I should say yes, and eventually feelings would develop along the way. Which I do think there were some of those situations. Yeah, but at the end of the day, they aren't forced into marriage. That is for sure. Um, and I'm sure a lot of the people start out that way, but just because of the culture, it doesn't foster healthy marriages. It doesn't foster healthy relationships at all. And are there marriages that are, happy? I'm sure there are. I'm sure there
Mm-hmm.
are families that are, pretty normal and not as toxic and terrible as many, many that I observed. Um, the view toward children was definitely the more of the idea, like, be seen and not heard.
Right.
Children were kind of considered to be a bother, and there is a lot of abuse that goes on in those communities,
Mm-hmm.
and it just doesn't get addressed. It isn't taken seriously at all. And what's happening is, and I think this goes across the board for all of the religious groups that aren't saved people. Um, when you have these false prophets in the pulpit, what's going to happen? There's going to be corruption, and so there were a lot of like pedophilia and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And because men are above everything, you have to coddle their egos. You can never contradict a man. You can never call man out on anything. That kind of stuff just gets swept under the rug. It's the child's problem, fault for being seductive. It's the child's fault for making up lies. It's the child's fault for tempting the man and things like that.
I had watched a movie and I had asked you, I remember when I asked you about it, I can't remember the exact name, but I said, is this that far off? Because it was a
Hmm.
girl that ends up getting raped by her uncle. And when
Hmm.
she goes in a mess and she's bleeding and her dress is torn, and her
Hmm.
dad is like, what happened? And here she is, just completely violated, a mess. And she tells him what happened, and he ends up beating her because he said it was her fault for being a Jezebel and her, being seductive. I don't
Yes.
understand how Amish girls can be seductive, or Mennonite or whatever you want to call it. I don't understand it because it's
Mhm.
ankle length dress,
Yes.
not form
Well, and
fitting,
that's
and it's crazy.
that's sorry. I think you're talking about the movie Amish Sin,
Yes. The Sins of the
maybe.
Amish or something like that. Mm-hmm.
So the Sins of the Amish is, I believe, like a 3 or 4 part documentary on some women who left the Amish,
No,
and
I
then
watched that one
Amish.
too, but it was the movie.
Okay,
I think it was a
right.
dramatization.
They
Mm-hmm.
have similar titles,
Okay.
yes. And I didn't think any of them were very far off base. I thought they were all pretty accurate. And that's very true. If you don't like what you're hearing, you 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 make it go away
Mm-hmm.
rather than dealing with facts. That's very much what happens. Um, I definitely I definitely knew of situations, and not to the degree that I would have evidence and I would be able to like report anything. But like I heard of stories, I knew of things that happened. And I think if you're if you are like a seductive woman, yes, it doesn't matter how you're clothed, you can still sin, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the idea that the clothes are what
Mm-hmm.
caused someone to be attacked,
Mm-hmm.
you're asking the wrong question. Monsters are going to be monsters. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter what the victim looks like. Monsters are going to do what they do. There's an exhibit that went up, I believe, in Pennsylvania somewhere, of called
Yes.
"What They Wore,"
Yes.
and there are baby sleepers.
Yeah.
There are almost floor length Amish Mennonite dresses, and modesty is a sin that is separate from a monster doing what a monster does.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't make immodesty right. That's still wrong, but it's as simple as immodesty. It's not her asking for it.
Right. Exactly. And that's the type of thing that I kind of heard from some preachers. Not so much anymore, although one was just went viral for saying something similar about how um, if a man ended up committing rape and it was with a girl who was immodestly dressed, if he was on the jury, he would free him, and that's terrible. Um,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
that's wrong.
no, it's terrible, and it went viral, and it was something that was stupid, and he said it, and the internet got a hold of it, and he has since apologized and said that was terrible, and he's sorry to
Mhm.
victims of crime like that, and I'm glad he apologized. But I do think that the older generation of Baptists need to be very careful, because that was
Mhm.
something that was prevalent in the 60s and 70s, even among
Yeah.
IFB, was the
Mhm.
victim blaming and the victim shaming.
Yes,
A rapist
and
is
it
a rapist. It's not
exactly.
because of how
And it
someone was clothed.
think about what you're saying to girls who were dressed modestly, and it still
Right.
happened.
Right.
Because you're telling them in some way you must have been asking for it. If it wasn't your clothes, it was the way you were walking.
Yep.
Well, what if she was just walking? You know that men tend to find a feminine walk attractive, even
Mm-hmm.
if it's a perfectly modest feminine walk.
Right.
Um, being a female is not a crime.
Right.
Being a female is not a bad thing. And the
Mm-hmm.
fact that men are biologically attracted to that is not a shame to a feminine woman. It's a
Right.
it's a, it's a normal thing, and men have to. And that's where it comes back to the idea that men are animals, because it's the woman's responsibility to deal with the man's desires.
Mm-hmm.
And that I was raised. My mother had those ideas, and she kind of tried to teach me that fear as well, in that you kind of always had to be thinking when you were around men, like, am I making sure I'm not tempting him? Am I like, just constantly thinking like,
Mm.
I have to make sure I don't stand up wrong or walk wrong or move wrong, or what if I talk too much, or if I say the wrong things, if I laugh too much, am I being too loud? Am I just all of those things? And now I just try to be like, I want to be a godly person. I want to be, modest in the biblical sense. At the same time, I don't know what's going on in men's heads.
Yeah.
I can't police them, and it's not the same for every guy. What may be attractive to one guy might not necessarily be for someone else. I'm not responsible for that. I'm responsible to be a modest, godly woman, and I want to do that, but I'm not responsible for men.
Yeah, I like that. And that's one of the things that we're going to be touching on too, just because with my more outgoing personality, I've kind of gotten flack before because I have a platform. I've kind of gotten flack before. Interestingly enough, by men that are not my husband, obviously. Otherwise, I wouldn't have this platform because I do believe
Right.
in the biblical roles of marriage. I believe that a wife should submit and honor her husband, and I believe that a husband should honor and love his wife, and cherish her. And so I do believe that I need to listen to what my husband's wishes are and desires are. And he's never had a problem with me having this platform. He also takes the verses in the Bible literally where it talks about older women. I guess I'm not super old, but I've had a little bit of experience. Older women teaching the younger women. And
Mm-hmm.
so it begs the question too, why do some married men feel the need to criticize another married woman, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's her personality, her laugh? I've often felt sometimes even if I laugh, I get looked at weird because I laughed, because I'm not just standing there stoic, no expression,
Right.
and
With
it's like
that
people
perfect
don't,
little,
yeah, it's like
the
people don't
perfect little
understand the
smile.
meaning of meek and quiet, and they just want every woman to fit into a certain mold
Mm-hmm.
that they have determined in their head. You know what I mean?
Right, right. Well, isn't meekness and quietness virtues that are promoted in the Bible for both genders?
Yeah, Moses was a meek man, one of the meekest man on earth. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and modesty as well goes for both genders. So yeah, and there's that's where that the gender roles become very screwy, whatever,
Yeah.
because men are supposed to be the leaders, but women hold the most responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's so backwards, like I'm responsible for you, but you're the leader. Like, how am I supposed to make sure you do everything right? But you're supposed to be the leader and the example and what I can look up to. Um, as I had a thought and I think I'm losing it. Something about, yeah, just like I think it's a weak and selfish man that needs to have the rest of the world aligned so that he can just exist without any difficulty.
Right. Right.
if
That's a
if
good way of putting
women
it.
if everybody else, especially women, does everything right, I'm not going to struggle with lust.
Mm.
And then now he's at liberty to do whatever he wants because, you know if everybody else did everything right, I would be fine.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, it negates the need for personal responsibility, and personal self control. If every other woman just does her thing, then I'm not going to struggle in these areas. And it could go the same for men too. But yeah. Um, so what do you think? How do you think? And I know this is something that we're all a work in progress, right? And we
Right.
often discuss just different things that come up in our own lives, in our own personal lives with background stuff, like the way we were raised. So, how
Sure.
do you think the perception of marriage growing up, seeing the marriages around you, now that you've broken free from that community, you're in a
Mm-hmm.
Baptist church, you're married to a Baptist man, you're saved. Most importantly, you're
Right.
saved. How do you think that that plays into difficulties now with you?
Right. Well, I'm pretty transparent about the fact that I really struggle. I have complex PTSD, which means that my past very much comes back to haunt me sometimes.
Yeah.
And I would say that there are definitely times where I struggle to trust people in general, and that can include my husband sometimes irrationally because he has proven himself to be extremely trustworthy. And so that's part of it. Also, I feel I put an insane amount of value on any preferences that he expresses. I have a really hard time with if he says, like, if I ask his opinion, right? And he gives me his opinion and then he's like, but I don't really care. You can do whatever you want. That's really hard for me. He expressed an opinion, therefore I am required to do that. I'm required to follow that in my head. And no, most of all, a lot of the time, my husband just wants me to be happy. My hair is a perfect example of this. I like the idea of having super long hair, but I find it really hard to take care of. And I also just the texture of my hair, the weight kind of pulls itself flat, whatever. So for the longest time, I would put up with real like hair past my waist, and I would have days where I would just like almost be having a meltdown in the bathroom because I hated my hair so much, but I felt like I had to have super long hair because my husband liked it. And one time he just finally told me, you know, I would rather you just cut it than feel like this. And I still may grow out my hair really long again sometime, but I know now that most of all, he just wants me to be happy. He doesn't want me to. He would much rather have a wife with, you know, shoulder length hair. When I say short, I don't mean actually short, you know,
Yeah.
but then have a wife who's having a meltdown every Sunday morning because she just hates how she looks before she goes to church, you know. So that's one example, and it shows up sometimes otherwise as well, where like it's okay if my husband says I can do whatever I want. It's okay for me to do what I want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could see. And Kaylin asked the question. She said, how do you deal with your trauma in a godly way? I still struggle, honestly, and it's hard not to slip back into old and unhealthy habits and behaviors.
That is a very big question, a very good question. I have not yet arrived by far. I very much still struggle with this. And one thing I have to come back to again and again and again is that God doesn't expect us to just flip things over with all the experiences we've had. Like, God knows our history, and He knows that we are growing as His children,
Mm-hmm.
and He has empathy for that. I think back to when I first got saved, when I first got married. I was very sick when I got pregnant, and there were days I didn't really get out of bed. There were days I would just be in bed all day. And I recently just had the thought that, you know, it's been a really long time since I've had a day where I didn't just get up and get dressed. There have been days I didn't feel well, I didn't get much done, but I get out of bed regularly now. I
Mm-hmm.
get things done regularly now. So I think appreciating the progress that you have made, and just it's just, you know, a daily thing of you get up and you try again and you just keep going. And I think if I was to track my habits and things like that, I'd be surprised at how much progress I have made. It's just that often I set completely unrealistic standards for myself, but not only that, one little mistake makes it, I will take it to mean that nothing, that any improvement I've made doesn't matter. And that's just not true.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not true. And I really believe that the Lord understands that we're humans, like we're works in progress, and it's a journey. It's not, you don't arrive at some point.
Right. I believe we will always, every single Christian in the world will be a work in progress until we have our glorified bodies. I truly believe that until we are
Right.
without this flesh, until we are without sin. And that's why I'm all for self improvement. You know, all of us. The ones that think they have arrived usually have the most problems.
That's very true. That's very true. Oh, and I just had a cool thought, and I'm really bad with quoting verses, but I came across this verse in Isaiah the other day about the new heaven and the new earth, and the old one passing away, and it will be forgotten.
Mm,
And that was, there was something about the way it was worded that I really loved it, because the old habits and the memories, the flashbacks, because I have CPTSD. So,
right.
and I hate it every time it happens. It's really awful. And someday that won't happen.
Someday it'll be gone. And that holds true for anyone that's been through rough times in their life, abusive times in their life. There is hope. There is hope. Maybe on this earth you might have to deal with those things. For maybe it's a thorn in the flesh, like Paul dealt with.
Right.
But someday, someday it will be all new. So let's go over. I know we're kind of took a long time in just the introduction, but what does the Bible say about marriage? Let's look at some verses. I'm just really going to go quickly through these. And then we're going to get into the wrong ideas about submission. Look at, just looking at context of verses, different things. Every home's different. We're going to kind of get into some of those things. But Proverbs 18:22 says, "Whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing and obtaineth favor of the Lord." And I found through a lot of these verses, it talks very positively about women, which is often opposite of what you might hear from some pulpits or, Hebrews 13:4, "Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge." The Bible talks very highly of marriage as a whole, for the most part, in the verses that I was looking up. And I would suggest that you do a study on marriage, on women. Genesis 2:24, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." One that we often go to. Ephesians 5:25 through 33. This is obviously one of the more well-known ones. And this is giving commands to women and men. "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth it and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband." So, and then there's a few more, but I think that gives us a good idea of biblically what marriage is and what it says about it. So let's go over some wrong ideas about submission. And this plays into the title of this, "Unnecessary Burdens in Marriage," because I do think this can cause unnecessary angst. This can cause unnecessary turmoil and take away peace from a wife's heart if she's constantly worried and obsessing about this. So, but yeah, what were some wrong ideas about submission that you feel went on? Now, I don't know how it was. This it can be kind of prevalent in the IFB world when it comes to this, but how was it when it came to how men interacted with other men's wives? I mean, did they ever overstep boundaries with you in your community?
Yeah, I definitely feel like there was that idea, like all women submit to all men.
Yes.
I definitely feel like there was some of that going on. And when you have a community as close knit as that, you can count on it that there's a lot of overstepping of boundaries, especially when everybody's just supposed to get along and don't rock the boat and, preserve the community at all costs. That means there's a lot of that. A lot of boundaries get crossed and you're not supposed to say anything at all. I had several times where I had people get very upset at me for not taking their advice because I was a young single girl. I should always take everyone's advice at all times. I should always want advice about everything and input on my entire life at all times because, as a young person, you're too stupid to make any decisions. It doesn't matter if you're an adult. And don't get me wrong, advice, it's good to be able to take advice, but then there's the opposite extreme where at some point you have to take responsibility. You have to make your own choices. And yes, I had that. And I think I've talked about the whole situation where I lived in Maryland and I had a landlord that um, told me I wasn't allowed to live in the house anymore, even though I had been paying rent and all that. Complicated story. Go back and watch the other video if you care about the details. But that was one of the things I didn't take his advice.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a minister, so one of those people that you really don't get to question.
Right. So do they call them ministers in your community or bishops? Was there like a main bishop?
Yes. So there's each most of the communities, if they're mature enough or like there's enough of members, they'll have one bishop and then they'll have a deacon. And as the church grows, they'll also add one or two just ministers, which they're just there to also preach and to support, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
they don't use the word pastor. I'm not
Okay.
sure why, they just don't.
Yeah, I didn't think that they did. I used to have a very glossed overview. I loved reading Beverly Lewis books, and I've told you this before about the Amish. I was in love with the idea of Amish because to me, it just seemed quaint and innocent. And it wasn't until I got a book on my Kindle and read it, and it was about, I cannot remember the name, but it was about a girl who grew up in the Amish, and she ended up being molested by her brothers. And it kind of gave me a different viewpoint, like, oh, this goes
Yes.
on. They don't have
Mhm.
internet and they don't have TV and they don't, how do they even get these ideas in their head? And then come to find out, I started deep diving and I was shocked and forever appalled, and the
Yes.
glitter was gone for me. My eyes
Hmm.
were open to a lot of the perversion that goes on in the Amish
Yeah.
slash Mennonite slash whatever you want to call it world. And I've spoken with other people. I know Wilma First is one who did not quite have the same experience as you growing up. She enjoyed her childhood, and there was, she didn't deal with any of that.
Mhm.
And I know every situation is different, but I do know it is very prevalent where it can also be prevalent in a religious household, a Catholic household, a Baptist
Mhm.
household. That can
Right.
also be
I
prevalent.
think it's worth noting that her a portion of her entire community left the Amish at the same time,
Yes, they did.
and I do believe that there are communities that are less toxic than others.
Mm,
And the fact that so many of them left at the same time speaks to the fact there were people there who were able to think for themselves.
right.
And so I believe her, that she didn't see any of that going. I don't think every single plain little girl is abused. I know that they have just recently come out with actual studies
Yeah.
where they were actually interviewing people, talking to people, and it looks like it's between 50 and 75% of young girls and or women. Um, so yeah, but and here's what I want to say to the people that have kind of a romantic view of
Mm,
these people who have horses and farms and they make their food and all that. Well, number one, you can do all that without being in a cult,
yes.
and uh, most importantly of all, these people are not saved. It is a
Mm,
false religion.
mm-hmm.
Why are you surprised?
Mm-hmm.
Why should we be surprised when we find out that Pentecostals are doing crazy stuff? Why should we be surprised when we find out that nuns have had, mass graves found hidden out back somewhere where
Right.
they were dumping people? Um, they're not saved. No surprise. It's a false religion, so it's worse than not being saved. You have a false religion with a false gospel. There's going to be reprobates involved in that kind of stuff. There's going to be people drawn to that because of the fact that they are twisting the Bible. It's it's not that surprising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good point. No, that's a good point. I have some points down here. So, wrong ideas about submission. We kind of covered that. Every woman isn't subjected to every man, which the Bible does not say. The Bible says to your own husband. Every wife is to be subject to her own husband, not every man in the world. And then also, every marriage is unique and your husband is different from other husbands. My husband, I was talking about it with a friend recently, and she was talking about how her and her husband are pretty codependent on each other. And I was just like, that is not me and mine. We are not we are very much independent people. but we come together at the end of the day and we've built this life together, right? But we also have our own things we do, and he's fine with that, and I'm fine with him doing his own things. And sometimes we travel by ourselves, and there's different things that we do. We're very independent people. So, can you touch on the fact of just realizing your husband is good for you, my husband is good for me, and that's kind of what we need to focus on?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's definitely that's definitely very true, and it's also something I've had to kind of work on internalizing, I guess, because when you live in a community like that where everything's so highly controlled, everybody's involved in everybody's business, and that's kind of how they keep their people in line. Everybody's judging everybody, and then these things come up before council, and the the ministers and the bishops and stuff, they get together and hash this stuff out and decide what's what. um, you learn to expect to be judged about everything at all times. And I have really had to, and I'm still working on this,
Mm-hmm.
to understand that not everybody's judging me all the time. And it doesn't matter if they are, because our marriage is our marriage.
Right.
Um, I know that there are a lot of people a lot of men that wouldn't be able to live with someone who has the kind of struggles that I have.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people who wouldn't be able to um, be there for someone who needs as much as I do, as far as like I struggle with emotional stuff. I've had a lot of anxiety. I've had depression and things like that since we're married. And not all men, and I'm going to say it like this, and I mean it like this, not all men are strong enough to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a special kind of mental strength to be with your wife while she's struggling, without just being like, well, get over it.
Yep.
There's a lot of men who can't handle that. And I was blessed to find someone like by some miracle, right? Because when I look back, I was fresh out of the Mennonites, 6 months on my own, and I meet this man, and we start talking online, and 6 weeks later I agree to marry him. I was like, looking back, I was so ripe to be picked off by some abusive man.
Mm-hmm.
I was so setting myself up for that. And I truly believe that the Lord put him into my life, and he knew exactly who I needed to meet. Yeah, so that's definitely something I'm still working on, is to just like, it's okay for our marriage to not look like that stereotype I was taught, because it feels sometimes like I'm failing. I'm not living up to that perfect wife who can always handle everything and never bothers her husband, because that was also, another message that very much came across. Like, you were not supposed to need anything from your husband. You were always supposed to just make sure that you were serving him 100% of the time. So a lot of shame for women needing something.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that was like emotionally or, being physically weaker. Um, that culture they tend to be very hardworking, which is a good thing. But then it turns into this whole judgmental thing, where they're always like quick to label people as lazy and things like that. So that's still something I'm working on.
Do you think they used their judgment of others and as a form of control?
Oh, very much. I mean, almost directly, right? Because
Yeah.
it was as simple as, if you observed something you didn't like, you could bring it up to council, and women were, interestingly enough, also allowed to speak in council. More so if it specifically pertained to women. I think it would have been weird if they would have thought it weird if a woman would have brought something up about a man in council. But women were allowed to bring things to council, at least in my community. Not all communities are the same. And then the local bishops and ministers would take it to the ministers' council, and which would span across all the states and counties that came under the denomination, I guess. And if they agreed on it, then it would be reported back to all of the communities.
Hmm.
So if I thought that it was wrong for, okay, Crocs would come up. Crocs shouldn't be wearing Crocs. So it could go back to the council and then come out and be told to every community, you're not supposed to be wearing Crocs. Interestingly enough, since I have left, Crocs have now been allowed. If you're just wearing them at home, they're now okay.
Good to know.
Yeah. Yep.
That's funny. Someone asked, how, okay, this is kind of just a general marriage question, but how do you deal with it when your husband is stressed because of work issues and is snapping at you? I know, love him and just be understanding, but it still hurts. So I guess maybe overall, how would you deal with, maybe the communication and coming across, your husband's coming across strongly or hurts your
Mm-hmm.
feelings or snaps at you or whatever?
Well, as someone who has been married for a little bit over 3 years and very much struggles like with that, I don't really have advice for
Uh-huh.
you. I kind of struggle with that as
Good
well. Like
answer. Good answer.
if
You're,
my
mm-hmm.
husband's on edge, I get on edge very quickly,
Yeah.
and I try to just like ride it out until we're both feeling better. I'm not very good at it.
Yes, my advice would be, because I struggled with this early on. I've learned a lot over the last almost 20, I don't know, 23 years, 24 years, whatever it is that we've been married. Let's see, my son is 22, so almost 23 years because it's right over a year after he turns that. So, yeah, so Chinello said, gently let him know it hurts you when he snaps at you. Give him some space right after work. Let him decompress for a bit before engaging in major conversation. I would agree with that. And a soft answer turneth away wrath. I've learned that if he's stressed out because of some situation, first of all, when he comes home, that's like his oasis. So he doesn't really want to bring those issues home. So I've learned not to ask about it. He just doesn't
Mm-hmm.
want to talk about it and not to take it personally. I know that's easier said than done because I realize he's under a lot of stress right now. It'll be fine. And so gentleness, just a soft answer.
Mm-hmm.
Let it roll off your back. You don't have to snap back. That's kind of what I've
I
learned.
guess
So,
I guess I'm fortunate in that my husband has a 30-minute car ride before he gets home. And I
mm,
think he
mm-hmm.
does like use that time to kind of decompress. And also, my husband's good with communication. He'll just tell me sometimes, like, I need to stare at a video with
Yeah,
my headphones on for an hour or so.
that's mine too.
So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
He'll
it's
tell me what he needs. I don't want to talk about it. Okay, just let me chill. Just let me chill. I know I don't even know if we're going to get through all this outline, but this has been good stuff. So, um, no man, the wrong ideas, this is going back to wrong ideas about submission. No man has a
mhm,
right to command another man's wife. Obviously, that's weird and twisted and kind of perverted in a way, I think, when men think that they have the right to boss around another man's wife. It's kind of weird. And then no man has a right to decide what another man's wife should or should not do. It's not anyone else's problem what goes
mhm.
on in another person's home,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. So, um, I don't think so much. I can understand after hearing how things would go to council and you would
Mhm,
be why it would be hard not to be worried that people aren't
mhm.
judging you now because it's
I mean, I directly saw the results. Like I would
mm-hmm,
directly have people judge me to my face. So I know it wasn't in my head, but then
yeah,
separating that was in the past, and now I'm not around that anymore. That's so difficult.
yeah. And I think sometimes we can maybe build things up in our head or imagine things if it's part of our background. For me, that wasn't really prevalent when I was growing up. I didn't have that. I was raised in an IFB church, but my parents were never on staff or in ministry. This has only occurred since being in ministry, honestly, for
Hmm.
me, because even in ministry, there's many churches, and our church really isn't like this right now. We've had people come through and leave that have been this way, and they tried to do this, but it didn't get them very far. Where I was judged constantly, and
Do you
you know,
think do you think that when somebody's a pastor or somebody's like you have a platform and you're talking and you're giving all these like ideas and kind of advice into the world, they feel like they're entitled to give it back or something.
Maybe. I
Like it
don't
doesn't
know.
make sense. It
Right.
doesn't like, but because I've had people myself, like I have this tiny little Facebook page. I write these and I've had people bring that back to me about situations it didn't apply to, like I didn't write it about that. And it was just like my Facebook page is just me kind of putting things out there. It's not like I mean, I directly say this all the time. I haven't arrived. I'm still working on this stuff. But sometimes I feel like people forget that. It's like if you're presenting a concept, therefore I'm going to hold you up to that.
Oh yeah. Well, and I think being a pastor's wife, you are held to a higher standard. And so
Sure.
people often get it in their heads that you're not people get it in your head that you're supposed to be perfection and you're not
Mm-hmm.
supposed to have faults. And I've never tried to come across like I know it all or I have all the answers on this show even. I mean, I'm growing. When I started the show, my oldest was 16. You know,
Mm-hmm.
he's now married and 22, starting his own life. And yeah, there's been things that have worked and there's been things that haven't worked. So I might adjust, you know, even throughout the years of the show. I might try to share things that have worked and haven't. But in the ministry itself, I think the pastor and his wife and his family are oftentimes not in my church at all right now, held to an unattainable standard where I feel as if, and he's tried to get this across, we should have the same standard for if you're a Christian, we should all try to be more like Christ every day. We should all try to be godly. We should all try to be getting better and more like him. So I feel for every Christian that should be the standard. Um, I have been told before many times if I can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. So in other words, if you have a platform, you're opening yourself to criticism and you just need to take it. So I've often been told that. I've been told you have a platform so we can criticize you or we can critique you.
No.
Um, the thing that I don't like about that is that I feel as if you're in the club, that's that's one thing, but if you're out of the club, they feel like they have the right to just tear you apart. You know, just make sure your kids are all turning out. But if you're in the club and something doesn't go the way you want it, sadly, or, you know, then it's like no one can say anything, you know. So it just depends on if you're
Yeah.
in the club or out of the club, really.
Yeah, and that's
So,
where it's like you're being a respecter of persons.
oh, there's a total respect of persons in denominations, you know,
Yeah,
in
I
clubs.
saw that a lot too. I saw that a lot too. Within my community, like certain people were above, like you couldn't hold certain people accountable, but other people, every little mistake was under a microscope. And yeah, it's weird. It's kind of bizarre, and I'm not exactly sure why that happens. Maybe it's because like um, if this person they have decided to look up to isn't perfect, they somehow feel unsafe or they feel threatened by that.
Threatened is the right word. Chanello actually just said something. I think maybe they feel threatened or intimidated. And I think intimidation is a big part of it. That you might be influencing their wives by putting your advice out there. And this is where that does have
Mm-hmm.
an element of truth because both my husband and I expect, my husband has much preaching towards men where
Mm-hmm.
he gives it to the men. You know, I try not to do that on this program, but I've had women reach out in the past that have been in not very ideal situations where maybe they are being physically threatened. And everyone knows
Mm-hmm.
my stance on that. And they know that I have a zero tolerance and that I'm advising women to not stay in a situation where there is physical violence at all. And I think that is
Right.
intimidating, maybe, because
Yeah.
I have an expectation on husbands to not beat their wives, you know?
And
So,
even if it's not that level, right? It's a kind of average marriage and they're still afraid of you influencing them. That speaks to not trusting their wives and not having confidence that your wife will be able to filter through what applies to her
mm-hmm,
and what makes sense for her situation. My husband was just telling me about that. Like, I guess I don't give much thought to other men judging me, but I guess that is a thing that happens. And parents too, sometimes, where they will decide that someone's bad because they're influencing my child.
Mm,
I had this happen to me where when I was younger, I was living in Maryland. These people decided I was influencing their kids against them. I don't know that we really talked about their parents ever. We were friends, me and this girl who was 17 or 18. And I don't remember that we really talked about her parents, but somehow because they were having issues, I was the problem. And I think my husband said he had that happen when he was a kid. So it's very interesting how humans are always trying to blame somebody.
yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing. In the past, if I've had a child that is not getting along with another child, I know I have to be there anytime they have interaction. I'm not going to be like, you know what, your kid cannot hang out with my kid because they are a bad influence. I talk to
Right?
my kid, you are
Mhm.
doing wrong in this area. I don't try to discipline that other person's kid or try to set that other kid straight. I deal with
Exactly.
my home, my children. And I think if we would all just stay in our own area, in any aspect, in our own, I can give general marriage advice, but at the end of the day, every home is different. And you need to ask your husband what he wants from you, not base your life off of what someone else's husband wants. And that's why I put the disclaimer out all the time. Here's some tips, here's some tricks, but if your husband doesn't want you to do this, don't do it. If your husband does
Mhm.
want you to do it, do it. And I think if we just asked our husbands what they wanted, and communicated that, it would be, because I could say, you know what, my husband's love language is food. I always make him the best food, and your husband's love language might be a foot rub, so
Right. Right.
that's going to be
Yeah.
totally different.
Yeah. And then that's where that very specific stereotype becomes a problem
Yeah.
because I want to provide my husband, especially soon after we got together. I would have loved to like make all kind like bake sweet things for my husband because my dad had a sweet tooth. So all men like baked goods and desserts and stuff like that, right? No, my husband's a savory kind of person. So if I want to
Mm,
make food, I'm not going to get that response over a pie. It's just not going to happen. And when everything's super intense for you, that can be hard.
mm-hmm.
That can be something you kind of have to learn that perfect stereotype of being a really good cook and a really good baker, maybe that's not what your relationship really needs.
Right. And I feel as a young bride, I had certain expectations in my head. This is how marriage is going to be because my mom told me this, and this worked for my mom and dad, and this didn't work for my mom and dad. And I really had to, through the first 5 years of marriage, I think first 5 years were the toughest for us. I really had to work through a lot of those things and realize my husband is different. He is not my dad.
Mhm.
He's got a different
Exactly.
temperament, different personality. And I feel like sometimes we can make things a sin that aren't a sin,
Yes.
and it's easy for even pastors have to watch out for this. It's easy for them to add to the commandments of men, or
Hmm.
add on to the commandments of the Lord, make them
Yeah.
commandments of men. And I don't know. We have to be really careful comparing, and we have to be
Hmm.
really careful making things a sin. Don't make things a sin that are like Crocs. Don't make Crocs a sin when they're not a
Yeah.
sin.
Exactly. Yeah. For sure.
And then I have some other verses here. I would encourage you all to look it up. How does the Bible say we should be as wives? There's a lot. Proverbs 31:30, Proverbs 31, obviously all of Proverbs 31, Proverbs 11:16, 1 Peter 3:3 and 4, 1 Timothy 3:11. And I think we have to be careful with letting men or women add to the scripture and adding, like I said, adding on to the commandments of the Lord, making them commandments of men. Um,
That's something. Sorry.
no, you're
Um,
fine.
that's something that I feel like I'm still trying to learn is that just because a concept exists doesn't mean it fits for me right now, right here.
Yeah.
I when I hear something like if you hear someone talking about, ways to serve your husband, all of those aren't don't apply. or
Mm-hmm.
you come across things, on Instagram or whatever, where people are talking about, I don't know, any situation, whether they're talking about relationships or the way you communicate, or your mental health or something. Maybe it doesn't fit for me, and that's okay. It can
Mm-hmm.
be as simple as that. And I often get very frustrated because it hurts. I feel like someone's like they're kind of gaslighting me or something, because that doesn't fit my situation. What probably fits someone else's. It
Mm-hmm.
it can be as simple as it's not for me. And yeah, that can be hard on both, if you're trying to give someone advice or you're hearing it.
Right. And then there's always two sides to every story. I have a hard time. A lot of times I have lots of women reach out to me and I'm only hearing one side. So I'm only hearing their side of the story. And I'm not a fool. I realize that their husband's going to have his side of the story too.
Mm-hmm.
And so that goes along with, when it comes to other people and other homes and other wives and other husbands, we need to be really careful and we just need to chill on our judgment of them.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm sure you're probably passionate about this, just
Oh,
being raised the way that you were with, you
hmm.
know,
Hmm.
all the judgment that went
Yeah,
in. And I do
for
feel like
sure.
it's a way, I do feel the judgment of others is a way to control others. If they are fearful that they're going to be gossiped about, or I'm going to be perceived as a bad wife, or I'm going to be perceived as a bad mother, words hurt. Words do hurt. Rumors hurt. Gossip hurts.
Oh
And
yeah.
I'm not going to say it's not going to hurt, but if you feel as if other people are talking about you or judging you, part of breaking free of these unnecessary burdens is, I guess, allowing those things not to change what you're doing if
Hmm.
your husband likes it in your relationship.
Yeah.
Um, part
I
of the,
think acceptance,
yeah.
just accepting, people are going to judge me.
Mm-hmm.
Probably not as much as I think they do or will, but it's a fact. At some point in life, somebody's going to judge me harshly, wrongly, maybe. Somebody's going to hate me. Somebody's not going to like me. And you know what? I can live with that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what you were saying about, oh, I'm losing it. You were talking about different concepts. Giving advice. Oh, vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
That's why people judge. Because if I judge you as not a good wife, I don't have to open myself up to learning from you. If I judge you as your standards aren't good enough for me,
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to become your friend. Your standards aren't good enough. All these judgments put distance between people, and
Mm-hmm.
it means that you don't have to be vulnerable. And in this day and age, vulnerability is something. And when I say that, I mean like in a connection kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
When you become friends with someone, it makes you vulnerable toward each other. You let them in. you
Yeah.
you um open yourself to the possibility of them hurting you, and
Right.
they will, because everybody always, in some way, to some degree, you hurt people. It happens,
Right.
because people are people. And I think that's a big part of it. And sometimes people along the journey kind of go back and forth between, they want to be close to somebody, they want to make friends, and then they pull back. And that can look really, it can get kind of ugly if
Mm-hmm.
they start attacking people. um, and it's hard. You never know what somebody's got going on. Are they really, is that who they are? They're just this mean, manipulative kind of person, or are they going through something, and that's how they protect themselves, by pushing
Mm-hmm.
you away?
Right. Do you feel as if, I'm going off script here, but that's all right. I'm enjoying talking to you. Do you feel as if you struggle against being manipulative or passive aggressive? Because I know those things are very indicative of a very repressed childhood where you were not allowed to voice your opinion and you were not allowed to have your own thoughts.
Yes. So I would say I lean into being very transparent.
Yes,
I
I
come
feel that way
across,
too.
I think I come across almost, um, almost aggressive maybe,
Mm.
because I so badly don't want to be like the people I grew up around who were passive aggressive, who were
Mhm.
manipulative, and all of that. I'm not saying I never act in those ways. Obviously, as a human, we all do all of those things, where sometimes we're passive, sometimes we're passive aggressive, sometimes we're aggressive. But I would say I tend to being very honest and very direct most of the time, because I just I can't deal with the guessing games. I
Yep.
can't deal with, but then sometimes that'll backfire on me, because when you are more direct, some people have a hard time with that, and then they become passive because they're afraid they're going to offend you, and that is something I'm still very much working on. If we're
Mm.
talking about relationships in general and not necessarily marriage, um, because then I wonder if I can trust people. Are they telling me the truth, or are they just saying what they think I want to hear? Well, most of the time I just want to hear the truth, but maybe in their head they think they need to answer the right thing so that I don't get offended.
Mhm.
Um, so that's something I still very much struggle with, and also like how to tone it back and be honest without being overwhelming,
Yeah.
and like being coming across too harshly.
Yep.
Um, yeah, because I don't want to be like the people I grew up around. At the same time, I don't want to live my life in rebellion to how I grew up.
Mhm.
I just want to live life in a healthy way.
Right.
And I think those are two ditches that survivors tend to fall into. Um, and it's a balancing act for sure.
You just described me. That's exactly how I am. I grew up in a household where manipulation and passive aggressiveness was used quite often, and also even in some Baptist circles, it is that way because you are thrown under the bus if you have a different
Mhm.
opinion or a different belief. And we were thrown under the bus when my husband was different on eschatology, and we found out who our true friends were. And
Mhm.
we've been thrown under the bus pretty much by every Baptist group that exists. So
Yes.
I tend to be very honest and very open in my relationships because I don't like the guessing games, like you said. I don't like passive aggressiveness. I don't like dancing around the issue. Just tell me what you're thinking. Just let me know what
Yes.
you're thinking.
And those are the people that you can trust, the ones who will tell you if
Yeah.
what they think you don't want to hear, or they'll
Mm-hmm.
be like, hey, I felt hurt by what you said or what you did. Like, the people who are transparent in return are the ones that I can trust. And I think people who know about my past, I
Mm-hmm.
think that can be hard for them. Like, they want to be there for me, but they feel like that means just being passive and letting me talk, and like it's a one-sided relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the last thing that someone with trust issues needs. Someone with trust issues needs you to be gently very honest with them.
Right.
Very straightforward.
Right. No, yeah. And I am in no way comparing my upbringing to yours because it was totally different. You definitely got the rough end of the stick there, but there are similarities in even
Sure.
religious,
Yeah,
different religious sects and things. So,
for sure.
um, so what do you do if someone else tries to put burdens on you, whether that's a preacher, whether that's another family in the church, because this does happen. So what do you
Yeah,
personally do if that happens?
I will probably have a flashback. I will
Mm,
probably get triggered.
mm, mm-hmm,
Privately at home, I don't usually explode in people's faces, but that's something I very much struggle with. My goal, what I want to do, is to learn to just accept that it's going to happen.
yeah.
People don't know the idea that I have trauma speaks to the fact that I went through something that most people don't. That's kind of the way you define trauma. It's something that's so severe that it changes the way you perceive the world. Okay.
Right.
Most people don't have trauma. I mean, there's lots of people who do. I'm not trying to belittle whatever. That means that a lot of people's perspectives are very different than mine. This
Mm-hmm.
means a lot of people cannot relate. It doesn't mean they can't empathize, but they cannot relate to the way I see the world, the way I understand things. And honestly, I don't want to use the word maturity because it's not maturity. Experience, I guess. I have experienced and seen things that a lot of people have not. I understand things that most people will never understand. And that's not a positive thing, it's a sad fact.
Yeah.
And so my goal is to just accept that that's going to happen. That's the way it is. It doesn't need to say anything about me. It doesn't need to say anything about my life and the choices I make. It's just a fact.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really good. I hope that anyone who's struggling in any of these areas, if you've had grown up in an abusive relationship or an overly, far right religious experience, I hope that you don't, on the flip side, maybe you didn't grow up with that, but you tend to be very judgmental yourself. Maybe this will help you just take another look at it. Maybe you just need to chill on the judgment. So, what is some, and I'm going to wrap it up real quick, your poor husband. What are some ways that you are trying to raise the next generation differently when it comes to your daughter? What are some things that you're trying to do different?
Well, I would probably say, besides the fact that I'm going to teach her the true gospel
Yeah.
and not tell her at 5 years old that the way to get to heaven is to obey the cult and the Bible.
Right.
Um, obey the Bible as far as you need to have faith. You need to trust in Jesus to get saved. But that's a pretty heavy weight for a 5-year-old to
Yeah.
carry. Beyond that, I think one of the biggest things is that I want to make choices based on what's good for my child and our family rather than how the community will perceive me. I very much thought, I literally had these thoughts as a teenager, and I still think it's probably true that a lot of my parents' decisions were made based on how it's going to look to the community.
Mm.
I did not feel like they did what they did because they truly thought it was the best thing for me and for our family. And that is a big one. I also am not going to I'm going to understand that my child is unique
Mm-hmm.
and she's not going to fit a specific box. There is no perfect answer where if she does XYZ, you have to beat her until she gives up. I believe in, what the Bible says about not sparing the rod. I do believe in that. At the same time, that's not the answer to everything. That
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't be your instant reaction to every little possible thing that inconveniences you, because
Right.
I do feel like children were disciplined for being an inconvenience.
Right.
You're screaming, automatically that's wrong. Sometimes kids have a good reason for screaming.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're in pain. It makes sense that they would be crying if they're in pain. Um, and maybe what they need because they're crying is a nap, you know,
Mm-hmm.
um, whatever. I don't have all the parenting answers, very much do not. But you have to put some heart into it. And I also think a lot of parenting was done even in very small children. Like if you were in public and your child was having a meltdown, you had to do something or people around you would judge you as a poor parent.
Right.
And like you obviously you had to beat him. And I don't think that's the answer for sure always. To what I'm saying is I choose to often let my child get away with more in public than she would be allowed to get away with at home, just because being in public is stressful for both of us. And
Mm-hmm.
I give both of us grace. Um, and that's hard for me because I often feel very much like everyone's judging me for my parenting. And they might be, people tend to be judgmental of parents, and that's okay. I'm not going to parent out of fear
Mm-hmm.
of what the world thinks.
Mm-hmm. And that's true in Baptist churches a lot too. You're often judged on your parenting. If your kid throws a fit, well, this is just due to lack of discipline ever. How about yesterday was daylight savings time and it messed all of our kids up and it was fits galore. And yes, it can be tough sometimes. But yeah, I do think that sometimes as parents we tend to forget to give grace. Me with my daughters, I've raised them a little differently. I often say Little Women is one of our favorite movies around here.
Mhm.
We it's I have like the Little Women, I have four of the of the out of the I feel like their personalities are very much like it. I feel like I'm Marmy. I feel like her husband, just the relationship the girls had with their dad and how much they loved him and how they love Marmy.
Mhm.
It's very much like my home. And sometimes I worry that my girls, they're going to be very selective, I think, in who they end up marrying because they know their worth, and their dad and I have really, really, really tried to hammer that into their heads, and they're not just going to settle. And so
Right.
they might live in my home longer than others, and maybe I'll be judged for that too, but I just don't care. And I've come to realize with my own family that it's not a checklist or, just this
Right.
checklist of rules. I've raised them with my kids that it's about the relationship with the Lord, and I want them to see that their dad and I really believe the things. We're not
Mhm.
doing it just because other IFB do it this way, you know.
Oh, yes.
And we
Mhm.
do things a lot differently. We don't really fit into a box in our family. Our family doesn't fit into a box. That's why we've been kicked out of all the clubs that exist. So we don't fit into a box, and we're not raising our kids that way either because we want it to be real to them.
Mhm.
So that is one area that we're doing things differently, I think, than the way we were
Yeah.
raised. So,
Yeah, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about, and maybe I should, about when we get to the teenage years. I'm very focused on where we are right now, but I definitely hope that when we get there, she's going to actually be able to have a relationship with me and come with to me about
mm-hmm.
things. I think back to how hard I tried, how badly I wanted that,
Hmm.
and how it just never worked, and I always suffered for trying.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can succeed in having that different and
Mm-hmm.
having her just, like you said, knowing her worth
Mm-hmm.
and knowing that whatever I do and whatever mistakes I make, it was with the best of intentions, because I am fairly certain that growing up, it was not with the best of intentions. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it was even with ill intention. And yeah, that's day and night. And maybe I don't know if this story applies here, and it I feel a little vulnerable sharing it, but I will. The other day, I was in the opposite room of my daughter was in another room, and I could hear she was doing something I had just told her not to. And I yelled at her across the house, and she could tell I was angry. And I was yelling across the house at her, and she started crying. And it just hit me, and this is going to sound bizarre, how grateful I was that she cried because I yelled at her,
Mm-hmm.
because it was so scary. What in the
Mm-hmm.
world is happening? My mom is yelling at me,
Mm-hmm.
because I wouldn't cry when my mom yelled at me. That was normal.
Right.
And to my child, that's not normal. If
Mm-hmm.
I'm upset with her, if she's in trouble, I get quiet and
Mm-hmm.
we get serious. And that's what I want to have the case. When there's a problem, we address the problem, not lose our minds and start screaming. And may my child never get used to her mother screaming.
Mm-hmm. That's good. That's very good. I have a similar story. It's kind of pitiful. Yesterday it was wild. Sarah said yesterday was wild, and I had taken Hannah was throwing had a meltdown, and I was dealing with that during the entire song service. Well, when we came back in, I was still just frazzled, and she was frazzled, and she was sitting next to me, and she was being good, and she drew a picture, and she held it up, and she's like, "It's me and mommy!" Like she was super excited,
Mm,
and I was still frazzled, and I did not smile. I just went, hmm. And she
oh,
got upset, visibly upset
oh,
that I did not respond, and I felt so bad. So then when I saw she was just like, instantly she just shrunk in
yeah,
herself because her mom did not give her this positive response. It reminded me of the study that the still face that they did where the mom does
yes,
not respond. That was kind of, and
mm-hmm.
she got very upset. Hannah is very, very sensitive to my how I perceive her, how I'm acting
Yeah,
towards her. And normally I'm like, oh, that's awesome, Hannah. What a great job. And it was just still face and she lost it. And so
Mhm.
that really showed me. And so then, of course, I was like, oh, I like it. It's great, you know. And then she perked right up.
Mhm.
But it instantly just showed me how in tune even our 3 and, 4 and 5 year olds
Yeah.
are to their
Yeah.
moms. And they crave that
Mhm.
love and that attention from us. So,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah. But any parting words? We're going to wrap it up. Any parting words for those who feel maybe as if, they have a lot of baggage when it comes to just these unrealistic expectations, maybe these wrong teachings. Maybe they think they are supposed to be submissive to every man, which I don't even know how you would do that. But maybe they think that,
You go
that
crazy.
yeah, that you would go crazy. And maybe they think that, that they have to treat their husbands like someone else is telling them to treat them instead of just asking them what to do. Do you have any
Right.
parting words of advice for women that maybe have a lot of baggage when it comes to that?
I would probably say that um, with all of life, you try to learn how to just bring your energy down and put less weight to things.
Mm,
If you're a super anxious kind of person with a lot of you get easily triggered and things like that, just try to bring the energy down. Most moments in time do not hold that much of an impact on 5 years down the road, 1 year down the road, a week from today, like most moments. So just bring the energy down and then you can, think through it and whatever. Um, because I very much spent my whole life like on high alert because
mm,
everything mattered so much. Was it probably a matter of heaven or hell, right? And it's not. Just let the energy come down a little bit. Um, yeah, I feel like I don't really have advice. I'm just muddling through. I'm just trying to figure it out. But be gentle with yourself. Give yourself a little grace. If you're trying, that's way better than a lot of people. There's a lot of people out there who are content to just stay the way they are and not change.
right.
And yeah,
Yeah, I think we both are desiring we're to be better. We're both works in
very much.
progress. We're always talking about that. Where can people find your writings and musings?
So I have a Facebook page called With My Whole Heart, and I'm on Instagram with the same. And I'm actually also on Threads. Um, with my whole heart. Yeah, that's the name of it right now. I changed it a while back. It used to be Rejoice in Hope, I think.
Yeah.
Um, yes, so you can find me there. I typically don't friend people on my personal page
Mm-hmm.
unless I know them very well. We've talked a lot, so if you want to get to know me, first of all, follow the public page, talk to me there, and then that's how. Um, oh, I was gonna I saw one question at the very beginning. I was reading the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Amish and Mennonites do use the King James Bible. They use the
Mm-hmm.
German Bible, prefer the German Bible, the group I was in, but they will also read the King James. So just wanted to add that there.
The German Bible's different from the King James.
Yes, I believe it's not quite as perfect, maybe.
Okay.
But it's similar. It's
Mm-hmm.
like it's decent. It's just there's a couple of places where it isn't quite.
And you speak German Dutch?
I speak Pennsylvania Dutch. It's
Pennsylvania
not
Dutch.
German. So I could probably understand most people who speak German, but
Mm-hmm.
most Germans cannot understand Pennsylvania Dutch because it's so like, um, it's so corrupted. I don't know. I don't know. It's a whole different accent. It's has its own unique words.
Okay.
Um,
Yep, that's interesting. I could pick your brain all day, but I'll let you go so you can get back to your husband and baby. Hang on tight. And ladies, oh, we got to answer this. This is kind of a deep one. You can just give a short version. Do you think it's okay to not speak with someone who has abused you in childhood?
100%, especially if it was like reprobate level abuse. But
Hmm.
even if it was just severe, like gaslighting or something, and especially if they aren't taking responsibility for it or they aren't sorry for it,
Hmm.
obviously, individual situations are going to vary. You're going to have to decide if you're able to live with the consequences of it, but there are 100% times to cut people off.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. I am a firm believer in establishing boundaries with toxic people that are not repentant, that have hurt you many times in the past. And yes, I fully agree with that advice. So I'm glad we got to that question very, very um, at the last of it. So hang on, Joyce, and I'm going to try to see if I can get this all ended correctly. So thank you, ladies. We'll see you next week.